Some killers are careful, meticulous, ghosts in the night, leaving no trace behind. But sometimes fate steps in, a single mistake, an unexpected twist, small, insignificant moments that unraveled the darkest minds in history. A routine traffic stop that exposed a monster lurking behind the wheel, a missing license plate that led to a grisly discovery in the back of a truck, a handcuffed victim sprinting for his life, revealing the horrors hidden behind closed doors. A serial killer recognized in broad daylight, chased down by an angry mob desperate for justice, and a blocked drain, spilling secrets too horrifying to ignore. These are the killers who thought they were untouchable, until luck ran out. Stay with us, because once you hear these stories, you'll never forget them. Ted Bundy. Traffic stop leads to a killing spree unraveled. On August 16, 1975, a routine police stop in Utah marked the beginning of the end for one of the most notorious serial killers in history. Ted Bundy, a charming law student with a seemingly bright future, had been eluding authorities for years, leaving behind a trail of gruesome murders across multiple states. His ability to blend into society, combined with his calculated intelligence and methodical approach to killing, made him an elusive predator. But in the early hours of that fateful day, a simple mistake led to his arrest and ultimately exposed the horrors he had committed. Bundy was driving through Granger, a suburb of Salt Lake City, when he caught the attention of Utah Highway Patrol Officer Bob Hayward. Hayward had been patrolling the area when he noticed a Volkswagen Beetle cruising in the dark without its headlights on. The car had been seen earlier in a neighborhood known for break-ins, and something about the vehicle seemed suspicious. When the officer attempted to pull Bundy over, he initially tried to evade the stop, but eventually complied. As Hayward approached the car, Bundy, always quick on his feet, put on a facade of innocence, claiming he had simply forgotten to turn his headlights on. However, the officer's instincts told him otherwise. When Hayward asked Bundy to step out of the vehicle, he immediately noticed that the passenger seat was missing. This peculiar modification struck the officer as odd, and further inspection of the car revealed chilling items in the trunk: handcuffs, a ski mask, a crowbar, an ice pick, rope, and pantyhose with eye holes cut out. Though none of these items directly tied Bundy to any crime at the time, they were enough to warrant his arrest on suspicion of attempted burglary. The arrest set off a chain reaction that would ultimately lead to Bundy's exposure as one of the most prolific serial killers of the 20th century. Authorities soon linked him to an attempted kidnapping case in which a woman named Carol Durant had narrowly escaped his grasp. Just months prior, Durant had been lured into Bundy's vehicle under the guise of being a police officer. She had managed to fight him off and flee, a rare feat considering Bundy's ability to subdue most of his victims. When she was asked to identify her attacker in a lineup, she pointed directly at Bundy, confirming suspicions that he was more than just a petty criminal. As Bundy awaited trial for the Durant kidnapping attempt, investigators began connecting him to a string of disappearances of young women in multiple states, including Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. His arrest in Utah had cracked open a case that had baffled law enforcement for years. Descriptions of a man named Ted driving a Volkswagen Beetle had surfaced in several cases of missing women, and as authorities delved deeper, the pieces started to fall into place. Bundy, confident in his ability to outmaneuver the justice system, initially represented himself in court. His knowledge of law, combined with his charismatic persona, made him appear less like a ruthless murderer and more like a wrongly accused man. He managed to manipulate not only the legal system but also the media, garnering a following of admirers who refused to believe he was guilty. However, his arrogance would soon lead to his downfall. In 1977, while facing murder charges in Colorado, Bundy saw an opportunity to escape. During a pretrial hearing, he jumped from the second-story window of a courthouse library and fled into the mountains. He was on the run for 6 days before being recaptured. But that wasn't the end of his attempts to evade justice. In December of the same year, he executed a more elaborate escape, this time breaking through the ceiling of his jail cell and walking right out of the facility disguised as another inmate. His second escape led him to Florida, where he committed some of his most brutal crimes. In January 1978, he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University, viciously attacking 4 women and killing 2. His killing spree continued until he was finally caught on February 15, 1978, once again by pure chance. This time, Bundy was arrested by a Pensacola police officer who pulled him over for driving a stolen vehicle. The officer, unaware of who he had just apprehended, soon realized he had captured one of America's most wanted criminals. Bundy's time on the run had come to an end, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. By the time Bundy stood trial for the Florida murders, the public had turned against him. His own performance as his defense attorney worked against him, as his grandiosity and arrogance alienated both the jury and the judge. The trial was one of the first to be nationally televised, and millions watched as Bundy, once so confident in his ability to deceive, struggled to maintain his composure. He was convicted of the Chi Omega murder and sentenced to death. In the years that followed, he confessed to killing at least 30 women, though experts believe the actual number could be much higher. His method of killing often involved tricking his victims into helping him with a fake injury or impersonating an authority figure to lure them into his car. Once he had them under his control, he would assault and murder them in the most gruesome ways imaginable. Bundy's reign of terror finally came to an end on January 24, 1989, when he was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. By that time, his name had become synonymous with evil, and his crimes had left an indelible mark on American history. The fact that Bundy was ultimately caught not through meticulous detective work, but by a routine traffic stop, underscores the unpredictability of justice. Despite years of hunting him, law enforcement never managed to track him down through conventional means. Instead, his capture came from a simple moment of bad luck, one that would finally bring an end to his killing spree. Joel Rifkin pulled over for a missing license plate with a corpse in the truck. On June 28, 1993, a simple traffic violation led to the shocking discovery of one of New York's most prolific serial killers. Joel Rifkin, an unassuming landscaper with a quiet demeanor, had been secretly terrorizing the city for years, preying on vulnerable women and disposing of their bodies with chilling precision. His ability to remain undetected for so long made him one of the most elusive killers in the state's history. But his downfall came not through a dedicated investigation or forensic breakthroughs. He was caught purely by accident when police noticed something as minor as a missing license plate. In the early morning hours, 2 state troopers, Deborah Spargarin and Sean Ruane, were patrolling the Southern State Parkway in Long Island when they spotted a Mazda pickup truck driving without a rear license plate. It was a routine infraction, something that officers typically saw multiple times a day. When they attempted to pull the vehicle over, the driver, later identified as Rifkin, panicked and tried to flee. A short, reckless chase ensued, with Rifkin swerving through the streets of Long Island before finally losing control and crashing into a utility pole in front of a vacant building. The troopers approached the vehicle with caution, expecting nothing more than a nervous driver trying to avoid a citation. But as they neared the truck, a putrid stench filled the air. The unmistakable scent of decay was overwhelming, prompting the officers to investigate further. When they opened the back of the truck, they found a disturbing sight, a decomposing body wrapped in a blue tarp. Rifkin had been driving around with a corpse in his vehicle, seemingly oblivious to the risk of being caught. The victim was later identified as Tiffany Bresciani, a 22-year-old woman who had been missing for several days. She was just one of many women Rifkin had lured into his deadly trap. Once in police custody, Rifkin's demeanor shifted from frantic to eerily calm. As detectives questioned him, he confessed without hesitation, detailing a gruesome killing spree that had lasted 4 years. He admitted to murdering at least 17 women, most of them sex workers whom he picked up in New York City, before driving them to isolated locations to carry out his horrific acts. Rifkin's methods were as cold and calculated as they were brutal. He would often strangle his victims before dismembering their bodies and disposing of the remains in rivers, wooded areas, and garbage dumps across New York and New Jersey. Despite the growing number of missing women and the occasional discovery of human remains, police had no leads. Rifkin's lack of a discernible pattern and his ability to blend into society allowed him to evade suspicion. Investigators soon searched his home in East Meadow, Long Island, uncovering a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. They found personal belongings of his victims, including jewelry, driver's licenses, and photographs. Rifkin had kept these mementos as trophies, a grim reminder of the lives he had taken. Among the most chilling discoveries was a handwritten list of the names and descriptions of the women he had murdered, as if keeping score of his own depravity. When asked why he had killed, Rifkin offered little in the way of remorse. He spoke about his crimes with a detached, almost clinical perspective, describing how he had struggled with deep-seated urges for years before finally acting on them in 1989. His first victim, Heidi Balk, was killed in a fit of rage, and after realizing how easy it was to get away with murder, he continued killing, each time refining his methods. Despite the horrific nature of his crimes, Rifkin's ability to stay under the radar for so long puzzled investigators. Unlike many serial killers, he did not fit the stereotype of a charismatic or manipulative predator. He was socially awkward, reclusive, and had no criminal record prior to his first murder. His unassuming nature made him nearly invisible to law enforcement, allowing him to operate without drawing attention. At his trial, Rifkin's defense attempted to argue that he suffered from severe mental illness, but the jury saw through his facade. His confessions were detailed and articulate, showing a clear understanding of his actions. He was convicted of 9 murders, though he had admitted to at least 17, and was sentenced to 203 years in prison. His case remains one of the most chilling examples of how a serial killer can operate unnoticed, slipping through the cracks of law enforcement while committing unspeakable crimes. In the end, it was not detective work, forensic evidence, or witness statements that brought Rifkin to justice. It was something as mundane as a missing license plate, a tiny detail that led to the capture of a monster hiding in plain sight. Jeffrey Dahmer, A Victim's Escape, exposed his horrors. On the night of July 22, 1991, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a single stroke of luck changed the course of history and ended one of the most grotesque killing sprees America had ever seen. Jeffrey Dahmer, a seemingly quiet and unremarkable man, had spent over a decade luring young men into his apartment, where he would drug, torture, and kill them before engaging in acts of necrophilia and cannibalism. His ability to remain undetected for so long was baffling, especially considering the sheer depravity of his crimes. However, it was an act of pure chance that finally led to his capture, a single victim who managed to escape. That night, Dahmer had brought a man named Tracy Edwards back to his apartment under the pretense of hanging out and drinking. Edwards, a 32-year-old drifter, initially had no reason to suspect danger. But as the night progressed, he quickly realized something was terribly wrong. Dahmer, whose demeanor had turned strange and erratic, forced Edwards into handcuffs and wielded a knife. He then began mumbling about his dark urges, threatening to kill and eat him. Despite being terrified, Edwards kept his composure. He understood that any sudden movements might provoke Dahmer into acting violently, Instead of resisting outright, he played along, pretending to comply while searching for an opportunity to flee. At one point, Dahmer became momentarily distracted, and Edwards seized the moment. He struck Dahmer and managed to break free, sprinting out of the apartment and onto the streets. Barefoot and still partially restrained by handcuffs, Edwards flagged down two police officers, Robert Routh and Rolf Mueller, who were patrolling the area. He frantically explained that a man had tried to kill him and led the officers back to Dahmer's apartment. When they arrived, Dahmer, calm as ever, tried to play off the situation as a misunderstanding, claiming that Edwards was simply drunk and that the handcuffs were part of a consensual act. However, when the officers stepped inside, what they found defied belief. As they looked around, one of them noticed a foul smell permeating the apartment. Then, on closer inspection, they spotted photographs lying on a dresser. Photographs that Dahmer had taken of his victims in various stages of dismemberment. It was undeniable proof that something horrifying had taken place within those walls. The officers immediately subdued Dahmer and called for backup. As more law enforcement arrived, they began searching the apartment, uncovering one nightmare after another. In the refrigerator, they found human heads neatly stored in plastic bags. In the freezer, more body parts were preserved for later consumption. A large blue drum in the corner contained decomposing torsos submerged in acid. Polaroids of mutilated corpses were scattered throughout the residence. The sheer scale of the horror was beyond anything they had ever encountered. Once in custody, Dahmer confessed to everything. He admitted to killing 17 men and boys, many of whom he had lured from bars, shopping malls, and even bus stops. His killing spree had lasted from 1978 to 1991, during which he perfected his gruesome routine. He would drug his victims, sexually assault them, kill them, and then dismember their bodies, often keeping trophies such as skulls and bones. In some cases, he even engaged in cannibalism, eating parts of his victims in a twisted attempt to make them a part of him forever. Dahmer's ability to remain undetected for so long was largely due to his unassuming nature and the failures of law enforcement. On one occasion, police officers had actually encountered one of his victims, a 14-year-old boy named Konarak Synthesamphone, who had managed to escape but was tragically returned to Dahmer after the killer convinced the officers that the boy was simply his intoxicated lover. Just minutes after police left, Dahmer murdered him. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer in 1992 was one of the most highly publicized cases in American history. His confessions were detailed and chilling, providing an unprecedented look into the mind of a serial killer. He showed little emotion as he described his crimes, leaving the court and the public horrified. Ultimately, he was convicted of 16 counts of murder and sentenced to 16 consecutive life terms, ensuring that he would never leave prison. However, Dahmer would not serve his full sentence. On November 28, 1994, just 2 years into his imprisonment, he was brutally beaten to death by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver, at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. Many saw his death as a form of poetic justice, an end as violent and gruesome as the lives he had taken. The fact that Dahmer was caught not through police investigation but because of a single victim's escape is one of the most chilling aspects of his story. For years he had managed to continue his horrific crimes right under the noses of law, enforcement, neighbors, and even family members. It was only by pure chance that his reign of terror came to an end, proving that sometimes even the most cunning killers can be undone by a simple twist of fate. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, caught by an angry mob after being recognized. On August 31, 1985, Richard Ramirez, one of the most feared and sadistic serial killers in American history, was finally captured, not by law enforcement's careful investigation, but by sheer chance and the fury of ordinary citizens. For over a year, Ramirez had terrorized California with a series of brutal home invasions, rapes, and murders, earning the infamous nickname the Night Stalker. His crimes were uniquely terrifying because they seemed random. Victims ranged in age from children to the elderly, and his methods were unpredictable, ranging from shootings and stabbings to bludgeonings and strangulations. The city of Los Angeles lived in fear, unsure who would be next. Despite an intense manhunt, Ramirez had managed to evade capture for months. His ability to disappear into the shadows after each crime left investigators frustrated, and the public gripped by panic. But his downfall came not from elite detective work or forensic breakthroughs. It came from his own recklessness and an angry community determined to stop him. In late August 1985, police finally caught a break when they found a crucial piece of evidence. Ramirez had stolen a car after one of his murders, and investigators were able to lift a single fingerprint from the vehicle. In those days, fingerprint analysis was slow, but it eventually yielded a match. Richard Ramirez, a drifter with a long history of petty crimes, authorities immediately released his mugshot to the media, plastering his face across newspapers and television broadcasts, warning the public that he was armed and dangerous. Unaware that he was now the most wanted man in California, Ramirez took a bus to Arizona, planning to visit his brother. However, upon arrival, he was unable to make contact and decided to return to Los Angeles. By the time he arrived back in California, his face was everywhere. That morning, Ramirez walked into a convenience store in East Los Angeles, oblivious to the fact that every newsstand in the city carried his picture, with the headline identifying him as the infamous Night Stalker. As he approached the counter to buy a drink, he noticed several people staring at him. A woman pointed at him and screamed, "El Matador," Spanish for the killer. Panic set in. Realizing he had been recognized, Ramirez bolted out of the store and ran into the streets. He frantically attempted to steal a car, but the owner fought him off. He then tried to hijack another vehicle, but a group of bystanders, already aware of who he was, intervened. A chase ensued through the neighborhood as residents, fueled by anger and fear, pursued him. Ramirez ran desperately, leaping fences and darting through alleyways. But there was no escape. The entire neighborhood had mobilized against him. Eventually, a man struck him over the head with a metal pipe, sending him crashing to the ground. More people joined in, kicking and beating him. By the time police arrived, Ramirez was bloodied, dazed, and barely conscious, with the mob still attacking him. Officers had to physically protect him from being lynched on the spot. Once in custody, Ramirez showed no remorse. He smirked during his arrest, taunting police with cryptic remarks about Satan. Throughout his trial, he reveled in his infamy, flashing devil-worshipping symbols in court and shouting, "Hail Satan!" His chilling lack of empathy and his disturbing charisma drew in a following of obsessed admirers, but his crimes ensured that he would never walk free again. In 1989, he was convicted of 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. He was sentenced to death, but due to California's lengthy appeals process, he spent decades on death row. In 2013, before his execution could take place, he died of complications related to cancer. Richard Ramirez's case remains one of the most terrifying crime sprees in American history, but what makes his capture so unique is that it wasn't the result of a meticulous police operation. It was everyday people, ordinary citizens who had suffered months of fear, who ultimately took him down. His final moments of freedom were not spent eluding highly trained detectives, but rather running from a furious mob determined to stop a monster once and for all. Dennis Nilsen, a clogged drain, led to his grisly confession. On February 8, 1983, in London, a seemingly routine plumbing issue unraveled the horrifying crimes of Dennis Nilsen, a quiet and unassuming civil servant who had been secretly murdering young men for years. Known later as the Muswell Hill murderer, Nilsen preyed on vulnerable individuals, luring them into his home before strangling them and keeping their bodies for days or even weeks. His dark secret might have remained hidden much longer had it not been for an ordinary household problem, a clogged drain that led straight to his downfall. The first sign of trouble came when residents of Cranley Gardens, a small apartment complex in North London, noticed that their drains were severely backed up. The smell of something foul had been lingering for days, and water was struggling to pass through the pipes. Tenants complained, and the property manager contacted a plumber, Michael Catron, to investigate the blockage. When Catron opened the outdoor drain cover, he was met with a revolting sight: chunks of what appeared to be flesh and small bones clogging the pipes. At first he assumed they were animal remains, perhaps discarded meat scraps. However, as he examined the pieces more closely, an uneasy feeling settled over him. The size and texture of the flesh seemed disturbingly human. Unsettled by his discovery, he reported it to his supervisor, who in turn contacted the police. Later that evening, Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. arrived at the scene to assess the situation. By then, some of the remains had been retrieved and placed in a plastic bag. The officers, unsure of what they were dealing with, took the bag to a forensic pathologist, who quickly confirmed their worst fears. The remains were indeed human. With this chilling revelation, police began questioning the residents of the building. One name immediately stood out: Dennis Nilsen, a mild-mannered former police officer and job center worker who lived in the top-floor apartment. When officers knocked on his door the next morning, Nilsen, ever calm and composed, invited them inside. As soon as the detectives entered, a nauseating stench filled their nostrils. It was the unmistakable smell of decay. Before they could even begin their questioning, one of the officers bluntly asked, "Where's the rest of the body?" To their astonishment, Nilsen, instead of feigning ignorance, sighed and responded with eerie nonchalance, "In there," pointing toward a closet. What followed was one of the most horrifying confessions in British criminal history. As officers searched his apartment, they uncovered dismembered body parts stored in plastic bags, a human head in a pot, and other remains stuffed inside cupboards and drawers. Nilsen sat calmly as he detailed his gruesome crimes, confessing to killing at least 15 men over a span of 5 years. Nilsen's method was as cruel as it was methodical. He targeted young men, many of them homeless or struggling, offering them food, alcohol, and a place to stay. Once they were in his home, he would strangle them, sometimes drowning them in a bathtub, before keeping their bodies for days or weeks. He would wash and dress the corpses, sometimes sleeping beside them, before eventually dismembering them and disposing of the remains in various ways, flushing parts down the toilet, discarding bones in trash bins, or burning them in bonfires. His previous residence at 195 Melrose Avenue had allowed him to dispose of remains more discreetly. But when he moved to Cranley Gardens, which had no access to a backyard, his disposal method changed. He began stuffing body parts into plastic bags or attempting to flush them down the drain, a mistake that would lead to his capture. At his trial, Nilsen showed little remorse. He claimed he had killed out of loneliness rather than malice, but the sheer brutality of his crimes told another story. He was convicted of 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder, receiving a life sentence with a minimum of 25 years, later changed to a full life sentence with no possibility of parole. Dennis Nilsen died in prison in 2018, but his case remains one of the most disturbing in UK history. What makes his capture so remarkable is that it was not advanced forensic techniques or a witness that brought him down. It was something as mundane as a blocked drain. Had it not been for that plumbing issue, Nilsen might have continued his horrific spree for years, proving that sometimes even the most methodical killers can be undone by the simplest of mistakes.